to speak on amendments in the other place, and I know we're expecting a vote very shortly, which will probably mean the suspension of this committee, but you'll understand if I leave and can't participate in the whole debate, which I want to do. My Lords, the regulations before us today are profoundly controversial, both in terms of their content and in terms of the procedure that has attended their development. In the first instance, they suffer from a similar legitimacy deficit to that attending the abortion regulations 2020 on account of the fact that they are made by the same parent legislation, Section 9 of the Executive Formation Act 2019. And just at this stage, lest I forget, I want to challenge something that the Minister said. It wasn't so much that what he said was inaccurate, but it wasn't the whole story. Because he said that 78% of MLAs voted for this. Yes, 78% of 30. But there are 90 MLAs, and so there was only 30 voting. And that wasn't said, but I think it needs to be said. However, for reasons I shall explain, the legitimacy deficit attending these regulations is significantly more extensive. My Lord, Section 9 of the result of a vote in another place on the 19th of July 2019, the impact of which exclusively pertained to Northern Ireland, in a context when every single Northern Ireland Member of Parliament who took their seat in the democratically elected House voted against this provision. And it becomes quite disturbing that continually we're always told by others who maybe have never been to Northern Ireland or very rarely are in Northern, we know better than you lot that live there. In other words, a provision that only pertained to Northern Ireland was imposed on Northern Ireland over the heads of its elected representatives. And
just to say, I spent the weekend before last in Ireland, just over the border, and in Enniskillen with my family. I had a lovely time.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed Northern Ireland. Most people that do come to Northern Ireland do enjoy it, because there's so much to do and so much to see. And even right now, we can provide the weather also, which we can't do always. But I'm delighted to hear that you've made a visit, and I hope you'll come back some other time. My Lord, while there is nothing technically wrong with using the votes of other parts of our Union to impose changes on specific parts of it in violation of the wishes of their elected representatives, every time that happens, there is a clear legitimacy deficit, which is why apologies were subsequently issued for the flooding of Sligo in Wales and the imposition of the poll tax a year early in Scotland. In the case of Section 9, however, the legitimacy deficit is more extensive because the Executive Formation Bill had been subject to accelerated procedure on the basis that it was just about one issue, and it was widely reported at the time that the clerks in another place advised that the amendment that resulted in Section 9 was not in scope. This meant that not only were profoundly controversial legal changes imposed in Northern Ireland, we were not even afforded the dignity of a full debate. Noble Lords need to understand that every time Section 9 is used, these wounds are reopened. In the case of these particular regulations, however, the legitimacy deficit is even more pronounced. In the first instance, while it was completely wrong to subject the controversial subject of abortion provision to such a cursory debate, and the use of the votes of MPs who don't represent the people of Northern Ireland, to impose abortion on them, the difficulty is greater in relation to these regulations, because the subjects of education about abortion availability and education about reducing teenage pregnancy were not mentioned at any time by any legislator during the rushed passage of Section 9. There was quite simply no debate on paragraph 86D whatsoever. In the second instance, while the Secretary of State went on to run a consultation in November and December 2019 about the drafting of abortion regulations, implementing abortion provisions, before he published the abortion provisions regulations, he has conducted absolutely no consultation on education provision on abortion and reducing teen pregnancy, which is most regrettable to say the least. Thus, if today preceded by no primary legislation debate in terms of the regulation-making power as it applied to education relating to 86D whatsoever. Now, and in relation to which the Secretary of State has not even bothered to consult, but I suppose that's the way things are now. This failure to consult is particularly problematic because not only was the NIO, Northern Ireland Office, subject to the general obligation to consult on drawing new legislation, but it was and is subject to the specific obligation arising from its human rights obligations flowing from Article 2, Protocol 1 of the ECHR, which states, and I quote, "In the exercise of any functions which it assumes in relation to education and to teaching, the State shall respect the right of parents to ensure such education and teaching in conformity with their own religious and philosophical convictions." The failure to consult in this context is also particularly egregious, given that when the abortion regulations were challenged in court on the grounds that there has been no consultation in relation to 86D and 86F, the court pointed out at paragraph 168 that the specific regulations they were considering had been subject to prior Northern Ireland Office consultation before the regulations were published, and that no regulations had been published at that time in relation to 86D and 86F, but that if the Secretary of State was to issue regulation to give effect to 86D and F, he should consult. The Court notes that the consultation which did take place in the context of the regulations was limited to the issue of abortion, but did not deal specifically with the issue of education on sexual and reproductive health or a strategy to combat gender-based stereotypes as set out in paras 86D and F of the CEDAW report. However, these paras are not referred to in the 2020 regulations, nor are they contained in the 2021 directions under challenge. In the event that regulations or directions are made in the future to deal with those issues, then there will be an opportunity for the Secretary of State to carry out a consultation. My Lords, the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee has drawn the special attention of the House to these regulations because of the absence of prior consultation on the regulations. In their report, the SLSC says, and I quote, "In response to our questions, the Northern Ireland Office also said that a consultation was not necessary because each school must have a written policy on how it will deliver relationship and sexuality education, and that this policy should be subject to consultation with parents. However, that misses the vital point that the regulations before us today, with the amendments they make to legislation, will have already been made prior to consultation on any consultation on guidance that the Department for Education might hold, or any consultation that a school might conduct takes place. The SLSC rightly observes, and again I quote, "It is striking that full public consultations were carried out when comparable regulations were introduced in England, and when similarly controversial regulations on abortion were introduced in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Office has not offered any convincing reasons why these regulations should be treated differently. The lack of a consultation was also the criticism most frequently mentioned in the submissions, including from teachers, parents and school governors, as well as representative organisations. Other points advanced in submissions included: the Council for Public Affairs of the Presbyterian Church of Ireland argued that school governing bodies and principals should have been consulted before they will be the organisations charged with implementing the policy, and the Transfer Representatives Council suggested that the current lack of a Northern Ireland Assembly made it unusual that the Secretary of State would act without engaging in consultation. Indeed, my Lords, it seems to me that the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee became something of a safety valve in the absence of any consultation on the wording of the regulations, because very unusually, submissions to the committee ran to some 55 pages of text which have now been published on the Parliament website. Of course, that is no substitute for the consultation that should have taken place on the wording of the regulations, and in particular the decision to give them a name with far-reaching implications that are now referenced anywhere in the parent legislation or in paragraph 86D of the CEDAW report, because the SLSC is not involved in drafting the regulation. Mindful of all these considerations, the SLSC states these regulations are drawn to the special attention of the House on the ground that there appear to be inadequacies in the consultation process which relates to the instrument. My Lords, the conduct of the Northern Ireland Office has not only been problematic because of its failure to respect due process in the drafting of the regulations, but also in their failure to facilitate full, considered parliamentary scrutiny of the regulations. As the SLSC points out, the regulations were brought into effect on the 6th of June 2023, the same day that they were laid. They state in their report, and I quote, "We asked the Northern Ireland Office why it had chosen to breach the Convention. At least 21 days should be allowed between laying an instrument and bringing it into effect. The Northern Ireland Office said that it was to allow the DE as much time as possible to progress work on the guidance and preparation for delivery of the education. The SLSC was, however, none too impressed, and went on to observe that the statutory instruments practice, the National Archives guidance for Northern Ireland Department, states, if the 21-day period is reduced, you are reducing the time Parliament has to scrutinise the SI. This should not be done simply for departmental convenience. If observing the 21-day rule is impossible, you must explain in the EM why the SI could not have been made and laid sooner, and why it had to come into effect on the day specified if the reasons are matters of policy. Explain why the policy requires such urgent action. The explanation in the EM should also include what the financial or other impact of delaying the legislation to meet the rule would be. It is doubtful whether the need to prepare guidance in advance of self-imposed implementation deadline of the 1st of January 2024 constitute a requirement for urgent action that justifies the adverse impact on parliamentary scrutiny. Moreover, this is no explanation in the EM or in the Northern Ireland Office's response to us of what the impact of delaying the coming into force date to meet the rule would be, and we are not clear whether work on the guidance could have progressed immediately, even with a later coming into force date. We also note that we made a very similar criticism of the Northern Ireland Office when it introduced regulations relating to abortions in Northern Ireland in 2020. It would appear that either the NIO has breached the Convention without adequate reason, or the timetable for producing guidance in advance of the implementation date of the 1st of January 2024 is so tight that a 21-day delay now would put it in jeopardy. My Lords, I will stop there, and I look forward to listening to what others have to say on this matter. Thank you.